I recently interviewed the director of the All of Us program, and I asked him what keeps him up at night, and he said, you probably think it's security, it's data security, but it's not. It's engagement, and especially diverse engagement. That is what worries him the most. So we now only have actually technically about 5 minutes left, but I know this is hard for a radio person to stay, but we'll just do a few minutes over our planned ending time of 5:30, and I'd like to invite the panelists up to sit in these very comfy seats, and I would like to invite you to think of questions, because even if we don't get to them, you can ask them at the reception afterward. And I have just one kickoff question of my own to start with, which is this, when you're ready. So, and Matt, we're going to start with you. So send us a postcard from the future. So imagine that we are speaking 10 or 20 years from now. What does your laboratory of the future look like? You can imagine the title of your future paper that's just been published in Nature or Science, and what were the barriers that you overcame to get there in 1 minute or less?
Okay. So 10 years into the future, so thank you for the Nobel Prize. It's
You're
been
welcome.
several years since then, sending a postcard from Hawaii. I think, and this has been touched on by a number of us, I think things are going to look different because we're all talking about leaving the, as Laura said, the brick and mortar laboratory. That historically in psychology, psychiatry, we bring people into our labs and poke and prod them, and now we're bringing, not just bringing the lab to them, but using their own devices and technologies to better understand their thoughts and feelings and behaviors. And so I think, I don't know the title of the Nature paper yet, but I think things are going to look very different, and there's going to be much more engagement and embedment into people's lives.
Thank you. JP.
So that's a great question. And so, let me just try to partially answer your question. I would hope that we are doing, obviously, more and more smartphone-based digital phenotyping. And the user engagement idea that was brought up by other speakers, many other speakers today, it's critical whenever you're asking people to do something. So whether it's you're asking people to hold their phones a certain way or take surveys and so on. But I think a key realization for us has been that if we rely on passively collected data, all that has to happen is that subject has to install the app one time, and that's it. That's all they have to do. So I would hope that in the future, we can expand. Hopefully it won't take us 10 years to get there. We can get larger and larger studies where we use smartphone-based passive data to try to develop better phenotypes, and then based on those, we can develop better intervention approaches. That's not a great title for a Nature paper, but
the title would have like 5 million people data in
something like that. Yes.
Great, Laura.
So for me, it's patient innovation. So figuring out a way that we can share research data with patient communities so that they can do innovation and they can build software and they can build tools and do research studies. So on a personal note, I have type 1 diabetes. So I have a device that measures my blood sugar every 5 minutes, and I have another device that gives me insulin when I program the thing, whatever. And recently they've developed artificial pancreas software in research settings in hospitals, but the community of patients actually has developed it years ago. And the reason why is that in type 1 diabetes, there's no way for a clinician to manage the amount of data that you have to deal with in order to make health decisions on a daily basis. So by necessity, the patient communities have had access to that data for a long time. And that's allowed them to engineer an artificial pancreas, a closed-loop system, years ahead of when the medical community did that. If we could do that with mental health, that would be incredible.
What a cool idea. Great. Lara?
I think for me it does come down to engagement, and because that's necessary no matter what we do. We need engagement even if it's passive data, because we need people to trust us to use that data appropriately. And so I think that that's going to be as big a barrier as it is for active data as well. And so we're going to need to overcome that.
And what about your paper that was just published soon?
I think my paper is going to be about engagement.
About engagement. Uh-huh. Great, cool. Okay, if you have cards that you want to, actually I don't think there will be time, but here are a couple of questions that we've gotten already. Number one, this is mostly for Laura, I think. How important to the success of Test My Brain has been the use of, quote, brain as the target rather than, quote, mind or the like? Does it destigmatize? Does it exploit love for neurobabble or something else?
So I have two minds about two minds, brains, whatever about this. It was a good choice. The website was almost called Mental Eyes, which would have been terrible.
Yeah.
But people Google brain tests, they hit Test My Brain as one of the top hits. And part of that is because a lot of the marketing that's happened is around brain health and around brain tests and brain games and brain training and brain stuff. To me, I have a little bit of discomfort with using that term instead of mind. I think mind is a perfectly good term. But I want, when people search for resources related to brain health, I want them to find things like Test My Brain, which is based on science, things like AARP's Global Council on Brain Health, not necessarily just groups that are potentially promoting snake oil are much more likely to use those sorts of terms in order to promote that. So if people are searching for those things, I want them to be able to find high-quality scientific resources.
So search engine optimization is an important part of research now.
Which is engagement and internet engagement too. So.
Yeah. Great. And here's one other question. This might be better addressed tomorrow, but in case anyone has a brief answer, the question is, even if/when we can diagnose with high objective fidelity, how can we improve the treatment paradigms? In parentheses, will pharma make better drugs?
Can I?
Perhaps
Oh, sorry, we were going to go first.
I was going to say perhaps only pharma can answer that question for sure, but there's great interest in having more sensitive objective measures that they can use to actually build treatments towards. So certainly that's a great hope of the field. We'll see.
I think that's a great point. What I was going to say is that what I hope we can do in the future is, rather than having one study with 5,000 people, maybe we can have 50 studies with 100 studies in each, 100 people in each of these studies. So if we can have these longitudinal intensive measurements, we can have massively more powerful studies. And so we can think about in parallel testing multiple different intervention strategies. And I don't know, I have nothing to do with the big pharma, I have no idea how they do this stuff. But I do think that having better powered studies and the ability to run multiple of them in parallel could be hugely beneficial.
Great. So if anybody has a burning question that you really would like to ask from a microphone rather than at the reception, yeah, go right ahead.
Thank you for a wonderful talk and discussion. You know, one quick question I ask is that, actually two quick questions. The first one is that, you know, for the suicide studies, you know, actually I find some medications, you know, particularly in the, you know, immunogenic, you know, studies when we run clinical trial, phase 2, phase 3, you know, some of the drugs, they can cause a suicidal ideation attempt. And people in the industry, they use the Columbia scales. And how does it differ, you know, from the one you know, invented? The second quick question is for the statistics professor. You know, I realize that the temporal relationship are very significant because, you know, the temporal relationship almost like part of the context. For instance, like subject or patient, they take the drug before and after. You know, when you take the measure, doing the online real-time data corrections, you know, it can, you know, give you, you know, good interpretation or even misinterpret, you know, the data you intended to correct.
Okay, thank you. So first question for Matt, I think.
Big question with lots of parts, so I'll try and address it very quickly. There's a lot of debate around the extent to which medications like SSRIs actually increase risk of suicidal thoughts and behaviors rather than decreasing them. There does seem to be an increase among youth in particular. A lot of people, I think a lot of these medications are pretty crude, blunt instruments in general, and a lot of the assessment of their effects are pretty crude, blunt instruments as well. The Columbia scale is a commonly used self-report measure that's very similar to a lot of other commonly used self-report measures. What we don't have a good understanding of is what changes might happen in people's implicit cognitions about suicide, to what extent might things like behavioral agitation, which you can pick up potentially with accelerometer or other kind of wearable device, how these things might lead to an iatrogenic effect. So I think our knowledge base there is pretty crude, and we still have a long way to go. Is a short answer.
I guess I'm the stats professor. My PhD is in physics, but I assume that it goes close enough. So it's if I understand your question correctly, I mean, of course, any data is prone to misinterpretation. So this is why I think that it's really important to think about the data deeply. So really try to engage with the data, really try to understand what's happening, work very closely with clinicians and your partners and so on, so you can have a better understanding of the data. And I believe I mentioned early on in my very short presentation that I think this is becoming the real intellectual challenge. How do we take these 1 billion something data points and turn them into something meaningful? I don't think there's a soundbite answer to that, but I do think that we need research-grade raw data collection. We need methods that are specifically made for this purpose, and we need collaborations with domain specialists. If we don't do this, I think it's going to be hype and no hope.
Thank you. We have time for one last question.
This is another question for you, Matt. So let's say, it's interesting what you say about the Columbia. You know, we use that in our clinic as standard. And I was looking at the latent profiles that you showed, and I have a patient that I'm working with right now who is that red profile. But I still don't know. I know that's what she is. I know that that's the data. I know she doesn't tell me when she's suicidal. But still the only tool I have is to hospitalize her against her will. What do you, let's say we implement the IAT in our program, which would be really cool. What do we then do with it?
Yeah, very good question, and that's right where we are now. So the short answer, and it's not a cop-out, it's the truth, is we need more data. So the data that I showed are from, the red boxes were 4 participants over a 1-month period of time, and they were at higher risk of past suicide attempt. Are they at highest risk for future suicide attempt? We don't know. So in short, what we're doing now is exactly that kind of study where we're following people using continuous monitoring, actively, passively, physiologically, behaviorally, while they're in the hospital. There's a huge increase in suicide death rate in the weeks after people are discharged, which is terrifying. And we have no idea who's at risk and who's not. It's a guessing game. Yeah. We're giving people IATs, we're following them continuously, and we're just going to follow as large a samples of people as we can, so we can do this in a much more science-based way to say, scientifically, what puts a person at risk and what is this person's predicted probability of suicide attempt or suicide death in the next month, week, day, so we can be more scientific about how we're monitoring people and making clinical decisions.
Thank you. There's so many other potential questions. I would encourage you to mob our panelists afterwards, but for now, please just join me in thanking them for